Ralph was a well-trained police dog, and he would obey commands from Get. If he would send him to get somebody, he would say "Fastin," which means get him, and he would just by Get pointing the finger at someone, he would chase, even if it was 300-400 yards away. He would know who to chase by just pointing Get's finger at this person. And he helped in target shooting for Get, because if he chased somebody and somebody started running, Get took pleasure in pointing the rifle and aiming and shooting that person. It was a real fascinating experience for him when he would have a target that was running because of the job chasing that person and shooting that person. I used to brush Rolf once or twice a week, and he would be very friendly with me. I used to sometimes, if Get was away from the villa, I had the job of making sure that his food, most of which was from the kitchen, certain types of food that the kitchen knew was for the dog, and was probably better and for sure more meat in it than what the inmates got. But the fact is that I was responsible for daily food for Rolf, and even on days when Get was not in the villa, and I was in those days officially at the Birstenbinderei, that is the manufacture of brushes. But most of the time I was just running around, and the odd time when my father was in the factory and Get was away, I would stay there and do some of the drilling, simply for no other reason but to be there with my father and produce a few more boards so that the people would have what to do, because it was essential that they had enough supplies to keep them productive. I have an episode that comes to my mind. At one time, Get was away, and I have had a day off, but that day my father had the night shift. So I stuck around the camp, went to the kitchen a couple of times, fed the dog, and in the evening when my father went to the night shift, I went to do some board drilling of the boards for the people in the factory. And I was really tired because I wasn't used to be up at night. However, I drilled some boards, and by the time I was really tired, I slumped over the drilling machine. It was a simple motor with a chuck at the end, and I stopped the motor and I leaned over the motor, and all of a sudden I heard a shot. There was windows in back of me, and I heard the window break, and I heard the shot, and I woke up, jumped up, and worried that maybe the bullet was meant for me, but no. One of the foreman, the leader of one group of the people who were assembling the brushes, laid down in the stack of hay, because we did make some scrub brushes from hay as well, and he sort of lay down and had a nap. And whoever it was saw it and shot through the window and killed him. And I found out the next day from Goeth himself that he returned at night and he wanted to see what's going on, and he walked by and he saw that damn lazy bum laying in the hay and sleeping. So I took care of him. And he told me that because I told him that I worked that night and something happened. He says, yeah, I know. It was me. And by the way, he says, I saw you also. But you are sometimes useful, and had a smile and walked away from me. So that's how vicious and tyrannic this man was. Sometimes I wasn't as lucky. I recall being in the barracks, sleeping with my father. We had a upper bunk, so that we were on the top of the lower, and therefore was considered a better situation, so you didn't get the dust and dirt of the straw mattresses coming down on you. It was sometimes during the night when one of the lieutenants of the Jewish police, a son of a rabbi by the name Finkelstein, who was an outrageous, miserable person, came running into the barrack and screaming, "Get up!" And each man, get up, and start hitting with his whip people to get out of the barrack. And I'm sure he didn't mean hitting me, because he knew who I was. However, in the barrack there was no lights, and we were on the upper bunk. So when he swung the whip, he caught me over my eyebrow, and I still have a bit of a mark from that incident. I obviously didn't have to go anywhere, because once I came off my bunk, he immediately recognized me and said, "I didn't want you to get up." And when he saw that I'm bleeding from my eyebrow, he himself took me over to the ambulatory and didn't know how to apologize. However, a few days later, that was healed. And like I said, I still have a mark today. Another incident occurred in the absence of Goeth. Two SS officers came into Plaszow, and from all indications they were sent in to clear out some of the less useful people. And it happens to be that they arrived during noon hour, and the night shift was in the barracks. So the Jewish police had cleared several barracks of people who worked at night and assembled them at the assembly yard known as the Appellplatz. And I happened to be with my father because Goeth was away, and I naturally was with my father at that particular time. So we wound up being assembled on the Appellplatz, and what proved to be a selection. And the Germans walked by the columns of assembled men, by the way. There was no women at that particular assembly. And they were in fives, and they walked by, and every so often the one who seemed to be the fellow in charge would point his whip at someone and says, "Austreten," which means come out of the row, and had a column of these selected men standing separately. And so we came about our column, and there was two young men, obviously religious boys, who had shaven heads but had payas hidden behind their ears, and that the German SS pulled both of them out into the column that they had decided were not very useful, and continued on. And as he passed the row where I stood and my father, he walked by and then turned around and noticed my father had a bald spot in the center of his head, and he pointed his whip and he says, "Austreten," which means come out of the column. And as my father moved out of the column, I stepped out, and I risked, because this SS man didn't know who I was and my connection with Goeth. I stepped out and in perfect German reported that the man who just walked out of the column is essential in our production of the Bürstenbinderei, which meant a factory of brushes, since he is the only one who knows how to sharpen drills for the operation that was required to make brushes. After sizing me up, he just said, "Ach so," which means, "Oh, yes," and then commanded both of us, "Zurück eintreten," which means get back in line. Whether that particular saving of my father meant only to extend his suffering for another 8 or 9 months, I couldn't at that time be sure of. However, I was very happy that I was able to save him at that particular instance, because 2 truckloads of the selected people, to the best of my knowledge, went up in Auschwitz, and we all know what that meant. We have noticed also, as time went on, that outside commandos, which were groups of selected prisoners that worked outside Plaszow camp and were in those factories housed and kept. For example, Uncle Giel Brichand was by profession an engineer, and he was staying in a factory called Kabel, which really means cable. And to the best of my knowledge, sometimes in 43, they closed that one off, and they were taken to an unknown camp. I have never ever heard from Uncle Brichand anymore. We also found that Velichka, which was a salt mine, and found out later from my wife today that they were also taken out of Velichka, where they had been kept on the guard and worked in the mines. Sometimes in late 43, they were also closed down or brought back to Plaszow. I have not been there anymore because one day Goeth said to me, I am going to send you and your father to a better camp, with no explanation, just the fact that a transport is going to be going to Grossrosen, which is in Germany, and the two of us, my father and myself, will be on this transport because he thinks it's a nicer and a better place than Plaszow. And so it came about that my father and I were put on a train in Plaszow, and 3 days later we wound up in Germany in a camp known as Grossrosen. After arriving on a railroad siding, we marched a few kilometers to the gates of the camp, and as we entered the camp, a real orchestra comprising of inmates played marching music, and we tried to walk as straight as we could through the gate. But as soon as most of the column was inside, those coppers and block leaders that stood on the sides of the gate whipped out sticks and whips and started screaming, "Los, los, get going," and start beating up on people. Then we wound up on another one of those Appellplatz that was a huge, well-kept, empty assembly place, and within minutes 2 SS and about 10 of these block leaders or kapos told us to get undressed, and we were told any valuables to be turned over to the 2 tables that were at the sides of the 2 SS. From all indications that I could see, there was nobody with any valuables after Plaszow. And then after we were stripped, we assembled again, and we were told the clothes to pile on one side of the assembly because we are getting new clothes. And one by one we had to pass an inspection with raised arms, turned around, bent over, and there was a couple of these couples that would check whether we have anything hidden in our backside, after which we were sent in to what looked like a barrack, but in fact it was a shower, a multiple shower wash our heads, and we took a fast wash, just a rinse, because there was no time. They kept chasing us. And we did receive clothing. It not necessarily was fitting us. Some clothes were too tight and some were too big, but somehow I managed to get a small size, and it was reasonably close to what I needed. My father wasn't as lucky. His trousers were very short for him, but he was a tall man, and therefore that's all he could get. We again assembled outside and waited till about 3-4 o'clock in the afternoon, at which time we saw trucks coming through the gate, and there was one SS man and two of the coppers that commanded people to get up onto the lorries that came through the gate, and each one of them took 30 or 35 people, I don't remember, and they simply went by numbers. Each one of the striped uniforms that we gotten as clothes had a number attached, and I don't remember whether it was 898 or 989. In any event, that was the number that I had, and my father had one number less than that. And when they counted up the people for the next truck, my father was on the truck, but my number was one too many. Again, I took a chance and addressed the assessment, and I told him that I've been working for Obersturmbannführer Goeth in Plaszow, and I request to be put together with my father because Obersturmbannführer has put us both on this transfer to be together. And oddly enough, the guy just walked up to the lorry, pulled one man off, and put me on. And that's how I and my father wound up leaving Grossrosen the very same day that we came in. We wound up late at night in a small little, maybe 10 barrack camp, which later I found out was known as Wüstegiersdorf, and that was our next home for a while. Wüstegiersdorf was like Wolfsburg, Falkenberg, a satellite camp, which I believe was under the jurisdiction of Grossrosen. However, I have never been in these other camps except for the one in Wüstegiersdorf. I worked with my father side by side in a forested area, and at the low end of the slight mountain there was a swampy area, and the group that we belonged to, my father and myself, was engaged in cutting the torf, which is soaked grass, swampy grass, into squares with shovels and piling it up in sort of stacks to let them drain and dry. And we have seen what that was used for. In fact, some of the German trucks used two huge tanks on the side of the cab, and they used the dried torf to get energy by burning them, and by using that as a fuel instead of gasoline. In the camp, there was a minor presence of SS guards, and the whole operation was ran by what was known as the Tod Organisation. The letter TOD, I think, was the initials of that organization, and they were primarily a supply and transportation division of the German army. They wore a different uniform, brown colored, with the initial of that organization on their sleeves, and the commander of our camp was one of those Tod officers, and he was primarily concerned about delivering torf and some lumber that other groups from our camp would be cutting down some of the forests surrounding area. The towers, there was only two watchtowers, a wire fence, not electrified, just a wire fence, because actually any inmate that would want to run away would have nowhere to go. We're surrounded with a mountainous forest area, and there was no chance of anyone surviving or even getting any help from any of the German population that we have never seen, because that Wüstegiersdorf was that remote from any village or town. After a few weeks working with my father in the swamps, I felt that I'm developing some pain in my ankles and my knees, and one day I just simply couldn't stand up on them, and it happened to be out in the torf fields that I just fell over and couldn't move. The SS guard noticed that, came over and asked me what was wrong, and I spoke to him directly by telling him that something went wrong with my feet and I couldn't stand up. And my father was trying to help me, and he said to my father, unbeknown to him that he was my father, he says, when the work is over, you look healthy enough, carry him back into the camp. And that's what happened. My father practically carried me on his shoulders all the way back to the camp, which was more than a couple of kilometers. But we did get back to camp. That camp consisted of about a half a dozen barracks, wooden barracks, in one of which there was an ambulatory section and another small section for recovery, in German Schonung, which means recovery for people that possibly got injured or had other short-term problems. The ambulatory section was ran by one of the prisoners, who happens to be a doctor from Lodz, and his name was Price, Dr. Price. My father brought me into the ambulatory section, and Dr. Price looked at me and put me into that part of the barracks for recovery. He, within few minutes, has discovered what my problem was, and he called it polyarthritis acuta, which in layman's terms is acute inflammation of the joints. Dr. Price was very limited with medication, although somehow I think he had found some ASA, which is the same as aspirin, and had found a way of mashing it up into powder, and I would be given this twice a day by one of his helpers. Also, he appointed someone else who had a bit of a wrist injury in the same barrack room that I was in. There was approximately 6 or 8 people, and they had different problems. Some limbs maybe broken, or others had some cuts or bruises, and they were there for a day or two. I was probably one of the longest patients in that room. One of the people that was in that room who had a slight wrist injury was told by Dr. Price to keep changing heated bricks from the potbelly stove in that barrack, to keep changing those at my feet. And while there was still some pain, it did make it feel better. And I recall at one point we had somebody from the SS come to the camp and review the condition, and one of those things that they reviewed is whether or not there was some long-term sicknesses in the revier, which was the ambulatory section of the barrack. And when Dr. Price was asked on the individuals, he would usually describe their short-term sickness. And when it came to me, he just simply said, he wasn't very careful, he'll be out of here in a couple of days. And again, saved me from being taken away, because some of the people that were caught in the barracks that were unable to go to work were transported away on that truck that went with the SS. And I am just imagining that they were taken away to their deaths, either in Auschwitz or another extermination point. After a while, I recovered sufficiently that by walking with a cane, I was able to get around slowly, but I was getting around. And Dr. Price has taken the steps to locate me in a place where I wouldn't have to go out of the camp, and he finally arranged that I would be one of the helpers in the kitchen, which required some manual help. And one of the things that required a few people every day was peeling potatoes for the kitchen use. So eventually I became a potato peeler, and not only a potato peeler, but I was there for days and weeks, and eventually I became the head of that department because I was there every day. And eventually, because most of the cooks that were involved in preparation of the meals for the prisoners themselves were mostly, with the exception of one, Hungarian Jewish men. And so in order to communicate, I sort of learned Hungarian and have been able to communicate with them. Some of the requirements varied, and some of the instructions as far as potatoes or other vegetables that had to be prepared manually. As I was in charge, I was speaking to the head cook and some of his helpers, and therefore learned a bit of the Hungarian language. Working in the kitchen was a beneficial occurrence not only to me, but I was able to give my father an additional bowl of soup or even some potatoes that he would be able to put on the barracks potbelly stove and cook. That took us right up towards the end of 1944. At that time, I assume the Russians were already approaching Poland, and it was probably getting too close for the Germans to leave a camp like ours to be discovered, and they have transported us to a railroad siding near Wüstegiersdorf and put us on cattle cars. After a couple of days, we arrived at another siding, and we eventually found out that we are in Bergen Belsen, and we unloaded and marched through one of those famous iron rod gates, and with a heading Arbeit macht frei. The time we arrived in Bergen Belsen must have been either late December or beginning of January 1945, and we were marched into the barrack. I think number was 24. Myself and my father were on the floor, lying on the floor among, I would estimate, a couple of hundred people in that one barrack. There was no room to lie down. We were practically sitting one on top of the other. And a few days later, I got used to the routine that at 5 or 6 in the morning, the doors, and there was a single door of the barrack, would open, and the Stubenälteste, which are the helpers of the blockleader, and they were similar to coppers at work, would yell and scream, out, out, los, los, get out, right away, now, los. And people were pushed and pulled to get through that single door, because if you were at the end of the remainers of the people that didn't get out fast enough, you would get hit with a whip. And so my father would sometimes just grab a hold of me and either pull me or put me under his arm and run as fast as he could by pushing other people to get out through that door. After a little while, my father made some sort of an arrangement with a blockleader or blockleader, who happens to be someone that I remember was from Lodz. His first name was Dovid, and he was a short, stocky fellow. My father either had something to give him, to bribe him or something, because as of that day, I was told that I am one of the block leader's helpers, and all my duties are to keep his little separated corner of the barrack, which was enclosed with some blankets and partially with some boards, to keep that section where he was having a cot on which he was able to sleep, and there was a very small sort of a table, and that was his private domain, and I was to keep that clean, and therefore I wouldn't have to assemble outside with the rest of the people at the head count when the SS showed up to do the actual head count, which was hour and a half after we assembled in that cold weather. I would have to come out to the head count, but for most of the time, through my father's arrangement with Dovid, I was able to stay inside, and that lasted probably for about a month, and it was getting close to the liberation time when Dovid became more and more nasty to me. Why don't I do this and why don't I do that? And my father noticed that, and he said, don't worry, I will fix it up, I will fix it up. And that leads me to believe that at that time my father still had either some gold or some other valuables that he would be able to bribe Dovid. One of the privileges for working for Dovid was that I would sleep at the entrance to his cubicle, and would have more space than the usual prisoner, like my father, who slept maybe 2 meters away from me on the floor. But I had the entrance to the cubicle, which was larger than the usual space, and at the same time I was sort of a guard that nobody could get into that cubicle while Max was sleeping in it. On April the 12th, 1945, just 3 nights before the liberation, I heard my father crying out my name, and I crawled over to where he was lying, and he pointed with his hand at the small window that was located just inside the roof of the barrack. There were several of those windows around for, I can't imagine ventilation, but they were very narrow, small windows, but you could see some daylight through them during the day. But this was at night, and my father pointed his hand at one of those windows and said to me, "Can you see?" And from time to time I used to see something that looked like a lightning in the dark sky, and it was kept coming and repeating, and my father said to me those words, stay alive, because the end is near. Can you see? And with those words, those were the last words my father said, because when I left him, probably minutes later, he died. I only saw the next morning when the head count occurred. My father was dragged out with other dead bodies to a pit that was on the other side of the barrack with many other bodies that were accumulating for the last week or so, and they were eventually covered with some earth, but I wasn't there to see it, because after that I fell in what could be considered a coma. I don't recall anything, I don't see anything. The next thing that happened is, after we were liberated, maybe a day or two, which was, our liberation was officially on the 15th of April 1945, and within a couple of days after that, I'm told by some of the people, one of which was a fellow by the name Mallinger, who was from Krakow and had been one of the original people from Plaszow that was still alive. And Mallinger told me that when the British, who liberated our camp, came into the barracks looking for people that would understand English, he and another fellow kept pointing at me, and I recall that I've been shaken by someone, and that someone was a British soldier who kept saying, "Do you speak English? Do you speak English?" He kept shaking me. And when I looked at the uniform, I was sort of scared, because I thought maybe it's a German. And then finally I realized he speaks English. And I knew enough from my English lessons in Volbrum that he is speaking English. And so I nodded my head and said, yes. That was what actually brought me back to life. They took me out on stretchers and put me into a ambulance, which was a Bedford ambulance, where I spent the next few weeks inside that ambulance. First thing that was done to me, they took me to a place that looked like a laundry room or a shower room. They took me out from the ambulance on stretchers and put me into that room where a soldier and a male nurse or medical helper washed me down while I was still lying down, turned me over, washed me, removed all my clothes first, and then when I was sort of put me on another stretcher and put some clothes that consisted of a shirt and some military pants. I was also hooked up to a intravenous and taken back to the ambulance, where I spent, as I said, a few weeks. The ambulance was then driven back towards the old camp, which is the one that we were liberated in, and I was checked by a medical doctor and another officer who explained to me that this particular unit was known as the 5th British Corps, and they will ask me to make announcements through a loudspeaker who is going to be mounted on top of the ambulance, so that the prisoners would be able to follow instructions, and I would be taken care of, which I was. The doctor saw me at least twice a day, and I was given different medications. I couldn't say what they were, but I know that what I had originally, like a diarrhea and cramping of the stomach, has been alleviated, and I was able, after a few days, to eat some soft food such as soup and mashed potatoes, and I was slowly recovering. My job was more or less 3 times a day. I would make an announcement of which barrack would be now served their food and when to go to disinfection and showering and all sorts of arrangements that people would have to line up for at certain times for clothing and other things that were given by the British. Every day people were dying from long-range starvation, and just simply because they couldn't stand up and walk to certain distribution points such as the kitchens, they were dying by the dozens. And at approximately a week after the liberation, the British, with their goodwill, have brought in a lorry of conserved meat such as spam and other, a whole truckload, and they dumped it on the side of the road between the kitchens and the barracks so that people could help themselves. Well, this developed to be a big disaster because most of the people that did suffer from long-range starvation would eat 1 or 2 cans in such hurry that the digestive system couldn't cope with it and caused them to major stomach problems and diarrhea, and within a day or 2 they died. So the goodwill turned out to be a big disaster. Following that, the British start organizing a different approach. They cleared and disinfected a large barrack where they, one by one, brought in people who couldn't walk anymore. They individually supplied them to the stretchers and bunk beds that were placed in that barrack. with appropriate foods such as soups and some food that they could digest. Eventually, they also start cleaning up the mountains of dead bodies that were now deteriorating, and they brought in bulldozers and backhoes and dug huge pits, and just because there was no other way, they used the front of a bulldozer to push the bodies, and they would spray or cover the bodies with chloride or some material looked white, like white powder, and that would kill the smell, and from what I understood, it would keep the disease from spreading to the living. After a few weeks, I was well enough. I didn't require the complete rest, and I was able now to move around, get out of the ambulance, and walk about and eat regular food. And I received my instructions of the announcement by, I think he was a lieutenant, and a British officer who was daily giving me the instructions, intimated that this original, what we call the old camp, is going to be completely liquidated, and the inmates will be transferred to a nearby military camp, which the Germans used to use as a training camp, and that the conditions there were much better, and every day, shortly after, another barrack would be transported out of the death camp into the military barracks of Bergen Belsen. There were two-story buildings consisting of solid concrete and bricks, and there were individual rooms on one side of the hallway, small rooms that would accommodate between 2 and 4 individuals on bunk beds, and on the other side of that same corridor there were large rooms accommodating anywhere from 6 to 8 individuals on bunk beds, and right straight from the staircase on each of the 2 floors there were main washrooms that were able to accommodate about 8 people to wash up, and 4 enclosures for the toilets. Transferring of the liberated inmates of Bergen Belsen death camp took about 2 weeks, and the time finally came where my British officer said to me, "Thanks, old chap, for all that you've done with us, but now you will have to move as well, and we will take you to your new barracks. And we were sitting in his car or jeep, and as I remember, I turned and looked the camp where my father was buried among hundreds of other bodies was now being liquidated. British soldiers with flamethrowers burnt the barracks, and I could see the flames, and that was the end of the death camp of Bergen Belsen. I was driven to Block 89, where I spent for at least 6 to 8 months. And as I arrived there, I became friendly with a man that was a bit older than I am, or was. He was in his 30s, while I was all of 17 and a half. The roommate that I've chosen to take my room, was Amon Goeth. He was from a small town in Poland, and for a time he acted like an older brother, telling me things that probably were advantageous to me. He was a good organizer. He would go and bring in from the canteen, which was a regional kitchen for 8 barracks. It was situated right in the middle between those 8 barracks, and would supply us with food and different British supplies, such as cigarettes, chocolates, and things that were usually given to soldiers. We would get them and would have to go to these kitchens, or canteens as we call them, to pick up our daily rations. And Amon would do this for both of us because the kitchen knew, and Amon usually was told to bring my daily rations, because I was engaged through the British to the building known as GB6.